Vengo de Chile, el bajo Chile es anónimo, actores secundarios en un filme antagónico. Ese Chile al que definen de clase media, pero tiene las medias deudas. This is Steve Zeltzer with WorkWeek, and this week we're coming on to the 49th anniversary of the Chilean coup in 1973. And this coup is not really commemorated in the United States, but the United States had a large part in the military coup in Chile. And joining us today is Ruth Needleman. She's a professor emeritus from Indiana University, and she is probably the foremost expert on the role of the United States, one of the foremost experts on the role of the United States, and particularly the AFL-CIO in Chile, and has written much about it and recorded much. So welcome to WorkWeek.
Thank you. A little exaggerated. I might know a lot, but since I haven't published anything, nobody knows it.
Well, it is in your mind, in your history. So
it's in my mind, and I have given many presentations, including a battle recently with the Labor and American Working Class History Association for them to put out a resolution asking AFL-CIO to open its files, which
very important.
Didn't even come to the floor. They dismissed it in kind.
Very important issue. So maybe you can begin, Ruth, by talking about you went to school at Brandeis and you ended up at University of California in Santa Cruz.
I got my first full-time teaching job in 1969 in Santa Cruz after incredible battles with sexism. My advisor wouldn't write me a letter of recommendation because he said women should not take jobs while there are men on the market. That was my advisor. And the only reason I got the interview was because a different faculty member in a different letter about someone else said, of course, he's not as brilliant as Miss Needleman. And he was standing behind me in the lunch line and said, are you Miss Needleman? So anyhow, yes, I started out at Santa Cruz. And by 1971, I had set up one of the first Latin American studies programs in the country because I was trained in Latin American literature and Spanish literature. And I was trained to think that social issues, history, politics have nothing to do with art and culture. You know, art for art's sake was my training. And I, of course, realized when I read a few other books outside of the literary field, like Andre Gunder Frank and others, that imperialism, in fact, was the most important factor in determining the misery of the vast majority of people in the hemisphere. So I got fired 3 years in a row because I went in, at that time, you didn't have to have written your dissertation. I was ABD and I was literally fresh out of my exams. And so on the pretense that I didn't have my dissertation done, they fired me. But in each case, students took over the chancellor's office. It was actually his home, demanding that I be rehired. And the last effort came when I had actually written my dissertation, turned it in, and gotten this unbelievable phone call from this same guy, this professor, who said, the first one I sent in was 200 pages. He said, this is way too superficial. I found out that he had approved much shorter ones. This time I sent him 500 pages. And he said, I am going on sabbatical in a year and I won't have time to get to it for at least 2 years. So I flew to Cambridge. I went to Harvard Graduate School and went to the head of the department who I knew, who lived in the stacks. That's just how cut off from reality he was. And I went to his office and I said, ever so sweetly in Spanish, because he didn't understand English, you have a choice. You can read my dissertation or you can handle my lawsuit. So I never defended it I got my PhD. They rehired me, and I took a sabbatical and a leave of absence and went to Chile because I wanted to know if there was a peaceful road to socialism. And I got some contacts through the North American Congress on Latin America, which has consistently been the greatest exposure of US imperialism throughout the hemisphere. During all the years of the Allende government, they were exposing the economic blockade, the work of the CIO. They were the first to reveal and expose the work of the AFL-CIO. So they gave me some people. I got down there, and so I had some friends, but I learned so much from Chile that I feel like I owe my entire life to them because it changed how I see the world. First of all, I was already a lefty. I was in a group. I was a Maoist. And I supported class consciousness. I just had never seen it. So I really did not understand what it was. Chile taught me every day what class consciousness looks like among workers. And I have a story, if you can handle it, really exemplifies this. I think it was my second day there. The weather was terrible because I got there in July. It was still kind of winter, lousy weather. And I had to take a bus. They said, just get on the first bus that comes. Don't wait until it's easy to get on or you think you can get a seat, because of the economic blockade had taken away all Ford parts, all parts to most of the buses and vehicles in Chile. That was Kissinger and Nixon responsible for that. And so I go outside and a bus goes by and there are people hanging from the windows. The door, I mean, people, the last person holding on to the person in front of them had their feet over the street. I thought, I can't get on there. But then the second one came and it looked the same. So I said, oh, I think I have to try. I ran up to the door. I threw my arms around a stranger, my feet dangling over the edge of the bus, and slowly got pushed in and pushed back. And of course, there were no seats. It was jam-packed. But I thought I saw a seat. So I kind of wiggled my way back. Turned out to be an empty seat filled with water because there was a leak directly overhead. So I went further back and I hear this conversation that has stuck with me ever since. Nobody but poor people, working class people, not middle class, took the buses. Everybody else had cars. Chile was a middle class nation. It was a peace, they hadn't had a military coup or any kind of authoritarian government for a century. I mean, it was stable. So I hear this voice in the back of this woman who I believe came from one of the squatter settlements, but she was standing in front of a man who was complaining because you can't get oil, you can't get matches. Look at this bus. You can't even get a seat. You can't get on a bus. And she walks up to him and says, compañero, which means brother. Compañero, you don't know anything. He said, the reason that all these issues exist is US imperialism. By then, I am leaning forward, wishing I had a tape recorder in my head. And she starts to explain to him the US blockade of spare parts for all vehicles in Chile. She begins to explain the origin of the shortages in the blockade imposed by the United States. And I'm thinking, that's class consciousness. She can connect the dots and he can't, and she's trying to get him to understand. And I thought that was incredible. But even more incredible in Chile, I never thought about ruling class consciousness. Yes, there was a working class and owning class. There was a bourgeoisie and there was a proletariat. But I kind of thought that people who have power and money were in the ruling class and they acted in their own class interests. No, 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 no. Yes, they do. But there's a difference because, and I can explain it later, I ended up interviewing the top leaders of the right wing. They were class conscious. And I'll just give you one quote. The head of the National Association of Manufacturers, whose name was Orlando Sainz, says to me over a glass of Chilean wine, which I never could have bought on my own, you know, in some ways we're grateful for the Allende government. And I looked at him because I was in complete role playing. Oh, why would you say that? And he said, because now we know everyone we have to kill. And I had a laugh. Now, I was very good at faking it. It has a lot to do with the dysfunctional childhood, but I should have been terrified. I never should have gone to interview the top leaders of a right wing that was about to carry out a military coup. But I was young. And so learning that a class consciousness that exists among the ruling class has to be warfare. It has to be based in a class war. They have to see themselves as fighting it and not just think that rich people should have more. All rich people think that, but that doesn't make them counter-revolutionaries in a conscious, planned, funded way. So Chile just meant so much to me because I understood class struggle, understood a lot of the issues in a struggle like that, which, you know, Santa Cruz, how would I have, I mean, certainly didn't learn that at Harvard, and Brandeis wasn't much of a contribution. So this was a hands-on that changed me forever. And I got into it because after October of '72, there was the first nationwide right-wing attempt to overthrow the government. And it had been organized by a commando of the top leaders who I'd been interviewing in order to stop the economy completely. Now, their view was if we can get not truck drivers, truck owners. It was not a truck driver strike, it was a truck owner strike. If we can cut off the distribution of food, if we can cut off supplies getting to factories, if we can starve out, especially the middle class, we're on the winning streak. They thought that the left would attack the truckers. Instead, the left organized every factory, organized every neighborhood, set up their own commandos. They had every industrial strip organized, not only to do production, but to use their vehicles to bring people to work, to get food into the neighborhoods. And the neighborhoods had little commandos that distributed the food in the neighborhoods. So by totally underestimating the working class, these stupid fascists failed in their first major nationwide attempt. So I thought, I'm useless here in Chile. You know, I was on sabbatical, I was a professor, I spoke Spanish. I went to the National Publishing House, Quimantu. I said, just put me to work doing anything for free. They said, okay, do a chronology of the October strike. So for a couple of weeks, I read every newspaper that came out. So I went to them, I said, why don't I interview those folks? I'm an assistant professor, soon to be an associate maybe. So I started with the bottom guy, the truck owner commando, the head of it. He was very public. And of course, he was so egotistical that having an American professor interview him, he introduced me to everybody else. He gave me insight, they all did. They all introduced me up the ladder, although he introduced me to a man named Julio Bazan, who was the head of an organization called Covert. I later learned it was a creation of the AFL-CIO. Coup Proach was organized by AIFLD, the American Institute for Free Labor Development, when Bassan was up in the United States. He was an engineer. That's who they mainly organized, was white-collar professionals, technicians, engineers in key sectors like mining and communications and banks. Coup Proach would turn out to be a key when they pulled the copper professional engineers out on strike in April of '73, collapsing the entire economy. But by then, they had already decided that the only option was a coup after the failure. So I did this work and I interviewed, and I typed up every interview as soon as I got home. I have to say that my sister threw out the package of the interviews, so I do not have them. But when I came back to the States, I was rooming with Joyce Horman, whose husband was murdered. And I was helping out in the Senate hearings. I testified, I believe, before 2 Senate committees, one on the economic blockade, and the other one, I'm not sure what it was. I have my testimony on one of them. And I decided while I was down there, I should interview the right wing here. And so I had the names of people that worked for AIFLD, people in the State Department.
And what is AIFLD?
The American Institute for Free Labor Development was created as part of the Alliance for Progress. It was the labor arm, although the people in AIFLD, all the top people who were appointed by George Meany, came out of the CIA. So for example, Serafino Romualdi was the first head of AIFLD. Prior to that job, he worked for the what was it called? The Office of Strategic Services, OSS, which is the predecessor to the CIA. He had been in charge of Berlin for the CIA prior. So the founding members of AIFLD were all intelligence people.
And the Alliance for Progress, who set that up?
Well, that was a Kennedy program, but it was a Kennedy program that said the only way to fight communism is to give something to the people. But it was always part of the Cold War. But he was never the Cold Warrior that George Meany was. George Meany was always a pain in the butt to the State Department, to the government, until Nixon got elected.
And George Meany was head of the AFL-CIO.
CIO, yes. And he had come out of the plumbers union. He was always a skilled tradesman who thought that the labor movement consisted of skilled trades, and that organizing Blacks, Latinx, Asians, Native Americans, women was a waste of time. And so he was more advanced in his hatred of anything progressive than most governments he worked under until Nixon got elected. As a matter of fact, I had so many interesting interviews. Joseph McCarthy had accused the State Department of being riddled with communists. That was a lie. It was riddled with liberals, people who went in to public service because they wanted to do good. Under the general tenet of capitalism, they wanted to do good. And they hated George Meany. George Meany, from, I would say, post-World War II on, controlled everything that had to do with labor, not the State Department. As a matter of fact, they were at war with each other. The State Department repeatedly, as well as the Congress, called for the defunding of AIFLD. Because if George Meany wanted to send a CIA person to be labor attaché, there was nothing the State Department could do. They tried. This one appointment, they vetoed 3 times. And he still ended up in the position. I don't remember where in Latin America. Meaning he was too powerful and he controlled. And for him, labor was not his interest. And everybody who worked with AFL said that the main interest of AFL was not education, not even reactionary education. It was an operation to bring down communist control of unions, countries, movements, whatever. And the more I interviewed, the more people, not only these liberals in the State Department, and I interviewed 3 or 4 of them, but reactionaries in labor who were part of this scheming underworld, they told me what they were doing. I had, top people in AFL tell me that the job was not to build democratic trade unions. The job was to get the communists out. And they said, we no longer teach trade unionism. And this was the person who followed Serafino. This would be Doherty, Bill Doherty, who was a real gem. He too came out of intelligence. Doherty said, what we teach is what we learned when we got the communists out of the AFL and the CIO. We teach them how to isolate them, how to build a force against them. And I can't give you the whole quote because it was long, but I have all these quotes. And another guy who was very honest, Wally Legge, worked for PTTI, Communications International Trade Secretariat.
Burn.
That's right. CWA was controlled by an anti-communist, feverish, warrior, Byrne. And he literally gave Front Royal, the AFL Training Center, to them as a gift. I think he sold it to them for $100 or something. And he had been involved through PTTI. So if you look at all these PTTI people, it was just like all these maritime people. They were all CIA infiltrated. And what the ITSs did, International Trade Secretariats, they had become almost useless after the Second International fell apart. But they were not US the way the AFL was. Therefore, and they were European based. They could send people, CIA agents, into Chile working for the ITS because they weren't checked. The money was, sources were never checked. And so the money, if it went to the AFL at all, they gave it to the ITS in Europe, who brought it back into Chile and gave it, they paid literally for the October strike, for the strikes in copper in April. They funded Fatherland and Liberty, which was the militia group. That reminds me of some other militia groups we now know, who created chaos in the streets trying to provoke the left, which never worked. And they just told me these things. And in some ways, I couldn't believe it, but I did the same thing. I took notes, except when I couldn't, typed it up immediately, and I have all those transcripts. I found them in the bottom of my closet 4 years ago. And when I reread them, I said, whoa, there's some hot shit here. Maybe I should say that word. Hot doo-doo.
You were on the inside.
I was on the inside. I mean, the head of it at that time was Jesse Friedman, who was the adopted son of Romualdi. I mean, the incest is incredible. Jesse Friedman was a total pig, but he allowed me into Front Royal. He allowed me to look at all the books. I have the name of every Chilean who studied in the United States ever, up to 1973.
And these training, you say that they were basically political operatives and they were training people on how to fight communism and communists in Chile.
Yes. And to do that, especially in Chile, which had historically one of the largest, strongest working classes in the hemisphere, they had to totally destroy the labor movement in Chile. And they tried it starting in 46. And I won't go into that detail because I do have every campaign they ran to take over the leadership of the main labor organization, which eventually was called the Coup, the C-U-T. And they tried to take it over. When they couldn't take it over, they formed another confederation that was totally US supporters that failed utterly. So they went back into the coup. They paid for the membership for all the right-wing unions they had created. And two people, one from AFL and one from an ITS, told me literally, we created unions we could work with. In other words, we weren't interested in reform. We were interested in destroying the people's organizations and putting in a front that was controlled by the AFL-CIO. And the AFL-CIO from the day, well, years before Allende was even elected, was involved in fighting communists. And as a matter of fact, it was in the 1950s that Serafino Romualdi wrote a notice, a letter to Mini saying, you know, we've been putting money in these anti-communist organizations in Chile for a decade and a half, and all we have had is one failure after another. So it wasn't just AFL. AFL was the front. It was very effective. It relied on the ITSs, and most of the people that were funneled into Chile were agents. Now, I'll just tell you about one other person I interviewed that probably was the most important. His name was Walter Polizzi. He was a practicing Reform Catholic, and he worked for the Catholic trade union movement before hired into AFL around 1966 to run their Food for Peace program. When I interviewed him, and I got his name from somebody in Nakla, he arranged to come to my house. That's the only place he would interview. Come to my house at 1 o'clock. The doorbell rang at 11, and there he was, catching me off guard. He would not take off his coat. He would not accept a glass of water. He sat apart from me, clutching everything to tell me his story. And he said, from the day one that I got to AFL, it was so suspicious. Number one suspicion, so many heads of programs were military intelligence officers. He said some of them disappeared while he was there, and they would bring in new ones depending on what had to be done. But he said there were so many operatives, and he gave examples of some of the people who came out of the CIA were working without any trade union experience, and as the Senate continually said, no knowledge of trade unionism either, who were collecting intelligence, finding, they would call it identifying talent. And they described it in detail. They would call meeting after meeting with the help of the corporation, whether it was Kennecott, Anaconda, ITT was the primary one at the beginning. And they would identify talent. Then they would invite them to an exclusive club meeting where they would drink them to death and find out really what they thought. Then they would hold closed door meetings with them. And eventually it was so clearly planned and strategized. And Polizzi eventually got fired, wasn't allowed, as soon as he expressed some suspicions to a fellow worker, he was cut off from everything. He wasn't allowed to go to the field, even though he was in charge of field operations. And he would get letters, he told me. He said, but there's worse. He said, almost every head of department was an Air Force or naval captain or CIA. And the worst, he said, was housing. And this is such a great story, because the whole housing department was just a bribery intelligence program. They promised so many housing projects and delivered almost none. In 67, 68, the Congress investigated the housing project and found that they promised 4 times more projects than they ever delivered. The ones they actually built were shoddy and dangerous. That they didn't have sanitation at all. And in order to get a place in the housing project, you had to fill out a 6-page questionnaire, which I was given a copy of. They wanted to know your mother's political affiliations. They wanted to know if you could take orders. I mean, this questionnaire is unbelievable. And so Polizzi said they'd fill out this questionnaire and then they would know who had talent. And they would recruit them and bring them up to Front Royal, where many went back on what was called an internship project, where they were paid to provide intelligence reports.
So they were political operatives and agents for the United States.
That's right. And Meany always said, as did his board of directors, I mean, Meany said, of course we work with corporations that don't work with unions here, because we're out to protect the best interests of the country. And they had the top corporations on their board, J. Peter Grace. I mean, they had dogs on their boards, and companies that wouldn't recognize a union in the United States, let alone Latin America. And they all praise them. J. Peter Grace praises them for driving the communists out. It had nothing to do with labor. And so the housing projects, in order to live there, you had to fill out an application. So that they had your fingerprints and your middle name and everything else, your blood type. But they reserved the right to veto anyone who lived there. They had to pass a certain level of loyalty to the United States to live there. And every housing project had a military commander living at it. And the ones they promised in Chile, they were never built. They promised them, first of all, to the communication workers affiliate, and they promised them to the maritime affiliate. But they didn't deliver, but they worked. And actually, someone in the State Department said to me that they looked for people who would take bribes. And so they came in contact with the most corrupt, disgusting people in Chile. And that's who they would recruit. And they paid bribes. One of the things they gave to the Chilean Maritime Union was an incredibly advanced ship-to-shore radio system that was used during the coup. Because otherwise they wouldn't have been able to communicate. US Navy ships were in the port at Valpo for Project Unitas, Unity. So the US was totally involved, the Navy almost more than anybody else. And it was naval intelligence that okayed the murder of Charlie Horman and Frank Tarucci.
And who are they?
They were 2 Americans who, like me, went to Chile to see what it was like to build a peaceful road to socialism. And they were active in a group that was known as FIN, F-I-N, that stood for the Spanish Fuente de Información Norteamericana, or the source of North American information. We would take articles out of NACLA, translate them into Spanish, write articles on the movements in the United States and articles on the undermining of Allende that was going on, origin in the United States. And they were both involved. And the Chileans would not murder until they got an okay from the US. And certainly Charlie had been in Valpo right before the coup and run into all these military people. And he became very suspicious. And one of them gave him a ride back to his house, where he was later picked up after the coup and taken to the stadium. Frank was also taken to the stadium. They found literature in his apartment, but they didn't take his housemate. And so it wasn't until the disappearance of both of them that people and some congressmen got involved to go down to Chile to find out what had happened. And that's what the movie Missing is based on. It's really a brilliant movie about the cooperation between the US military and the Chilean, US intelligence and the Chilean, in bringing off the coup and getting rid of hated US citizens.
How central was the AFL-CIO, AFL in this coup?
Totally. The people that came in, they sent in, who were helping. They built Couproach, which almost single-handedly brought down the government in April because it closed down a copper mine, which accounted for the majority of income that they got in foreign exchange. They identified, as they do here too, they identified all the lefties to the military. Everything they found out about people, they gave to American intelligence, who gave it to Chilean intelligence. They basically put a target on progressive leaders in the labor movement so they would be killed. They were Orlando Signs puppies who were, telling people who you had to kill. And so it wasn't minor, and it wasn't just that they were teaching a form of trade unionism that had absolutely no use in Latin America. And there were two people from the State Department who told me directly, I would quote if I had my fingers on it, but told me directly that they trained people to work with the CIA. They gave cover to the CIA people. And the money, this was great. There's a report that the CIA put out, Covert Action in Chile, which I managed to have a copy of. There's still things that are whited out in it, but I got a copy of it probably because I testified in front of the Senate committee. And it gives amount of money. It points out from the very beginning, covert United States involvement in Chile in the decade between 1963 and 73 was continuous and massive. They go on to point out, it's the Senate Select Committee report on covert action in Chile, 1963 to 73. And it talks, for example, that between 70 and the military coup, $8 million was spent covertly. Now, that doesn't mean that was the sum total, but they go on to specify that when the money went kind of legally through AFL, that money was changed on the black market. Its value was 5 times the value of the escudo. So that it wasn't, 8 million, it was 40 million in 1970 dollars. And they gave it, one of the main recipients right before the October stoppage was SAFOFA, the National Association of Manufacturers. The richest organization in Chile got this huge millions of dollar gift from the United States through the ITS that went to Fatherland and Liberty to carry out chaos throughout the country. Because the head of SAFOFA like the head of the Agricultural Society, were both the two key leaders of the Commando and leaders of the far right and founders of Fatherland and Liberty, the fascist organization. A million ties bind them.
And it sounds like this has continued in Ukraine and many other countries, that the AFL-CIO, through the National Endowment of Democracy, which resulted from the exposure of the AIFLD, these hearings led to a change. But it sounds like they operate in a similar way. The operations.
Let me point out that the ITSs became all apparent right after they discovered all these front foundations that were channeling CIA money into the countries. Suddenly, the ITSs were active organizations channeling all this money. They were just the cover that took the place of the private foundations. AFL has been replaced by the Solidarity Center that is still funded by AID, the Agency for International Development, for the development of counter-revolutionaries internationally, is what it would be. And the NED took over a lot of the funneling of money, and you see it in Korea, you see it in Taiwan, they are everywhere. But getting information on NED is a little bit difficult. There is a dissertation on the National Endowment, but I don't know that he's published yet.
So you were doing these interviews with the leaders of the coup in Chile, and who were working with the AFL-CIO, who were working with the Chilean military, who are working with the heads of the corporations, the capitalists in Chile, conspiring together. And that must have been a very dangerous position to be in.
It was incredibly dangerous. In retrospect, I can say it was incredibly stupid. And when I left the country, and I had to leave by early February because I had to go back to the University of California. I had to teach a trimester because I took a sabbatical for a trimester. And they had, by that time, the Communist Party in Chile had picked me up meeting with all these right-wing people. They decided that I was CIA, and they were beginning to follow me. The right wing figured out that I wasn't who I said I was, and they began to follow me. And my friends that I was turning the information over to on the left said, "You have to get out of here. We will take you to the airport." And a huge team of people accompanied me out of the country. And I planned to go back because I'm that stupid. But they wrote and said, "You cannot come back. You will be killed the second you step foot." So I came back, taught that quarter, quit my job, went to work for Cesar Chavez until the coup. And then I realized I have to go to New York and write up what I know. So I did write a 100-page manuscript on AFL, on the labor movement in Chile, the history of it, and all the things that happened, which I never published. I had a dispute with some people over whether I could criticize the Communist Party. And I felt, because I was an anti-revisionist, pure and simple, that you had to expose them. It was the Communist Party that advocated bringing the military into the government. That's how Pinochet became part of the government of Allende. They also agreed to work with the military to raid every factory commando to make sure no one had arms. And they went out of their way to make sure the working class was disarmed so the military wouldn't overthrow the government. And so the government was saying no to civil war. You can't say no to a civil war that's already being fought. That's putting your head in the sand and disarming everybody. And so part of what I wrote also pointed out some of the weaknesses and also some of the impossible contradictions. Would the Chilean right have been able to do what they did without the United States? the United States played such a major role, funded the military, provided the equipment for the military, funded all the right-wing attacks, assaults on the government, and they kept getting worse. And so can a peaceful road to socialism work anywhere as long as there are capitalists in power? My conclusion as a young, naive, stupid girl was no. There could not have been a peaceful road to socialism. The US would not have allowed it. And they're still pretty clearly not allowing it because of what they did in Bolivia, what they do in Venezuela, what they've done in every country in the hemisphere, and in Africa and Asia as well.
And the coup brought in not only military, brought in the economic transformation of Chile.
Oh, it was long in coming because they did try a few things in Brazil in '64, but Brazil's military takeover was not in its early stage as brutal and complete as what happened in Chile. In Chile, key economists were sent up to study at the University of Chicago School of Economics with Milton Friedman. They were teaching radical free marketism, meaning that all regulations, all government intervention have to remove so the market can work its magic. And they trained these Chileans, including the brother of the past president of Chile, on how, with the coup and a clean slate, right? Because they wiped out everybody whose name they knew, that they could impose this harsh regime and there was no one left to fight it. And so there is a movie called Los Chicago Boys that actually is filmed in the 60s and 70s that shows all these Chileans studying at the University of Chicago. And Milton Friedman created the model for neoliberalism in Chile in 1973. They destroyed every structure. They ended the pension system. They ended they privatized everything. The vast majority of Chileans lost whatever retirement they had because it was all privatized and they couldn't afford to buy it. Plus, the numbers of people murdered, it's impossible to have an accurate figure. They just recently found hundreds of bodies in a mine. And there's a photographer who took pictures of the discovery who were hoping to show at the gallery in Chicago next year on the 50th anniversary. But they put people into concentration camps, they tortured, and really you can look at the Disaster Capitalism book by Naomi Klein, the first couple chapters, to understand how they used torture that they knew did not work to terrorize people. And there's a fellow up here in Chicago who was a student leader in Chile. He was arrested. His parents were put in a concentration camp with his 2-year-old son. He was sent to 3 different concentration camps, tortured, exiled to Europe, where he led the resistance. He now lives in Chicago. But the terror was so immense. They tried to do what Orlando Sign said, kill anybody connected to the Popular Unity government. So there would be nothing left to reorganize.
And these policies, Milton Friedman, the Chicago School, the market economy, it seems like those are still being implemented around the world as a solution to the problems. And that the AFL-CIO is supporting these policies through the Solidarity Center.
Absolutely. And because Meany and everybody who came after him make it clear, they have no problem with capitalism. The only question is how much do we get? And I have all these quotes where they talk about this. They are so clear. so outspokenly public because they feared nothing. But yes, the pillars of neoliberalism are three: privatization, deregulation, and outsourcing of jobs. Now the United States is a victim of Milton Friedman in the University of Chicago. And I will do my darndest, but I'm not very powerful, so I don't know how to go. But I will call for a protest at the School of Economics next September on the 50th anniversary of the coup.
And how does Liz Schiller's head of the AFL-CIO, she was on the board of National Endowment for Democracy and Solidarity Center, how do they justify carrying out economic policies which they argue against in the United States? They say they're against privatization, they say they're against deregulation, yet they're for these policies and implementing them all over the world.
There's an incredible interview that was done in the 90s with William Doherty, who for a long time was the head of AIFLD. And in it, he talks about how there's a new form of capitalism that they call neoliberal that has forced us to make some changes in how we do things. And he talks about how it led them to begin to talk about human rights if they wanted to make any friends in the third world, and how they had to shift their policies around. Obviously, there was enormous suffering, but that enormous suffering did not join up with the AFL-CIO, it joined up with the left. And so what we're seeing, we saw two huge waves. They called it the pink wave or the red wave of policies. There was a period in the 70s when all these governments were being overthrown by democratic coalitions. Different times, different places. In Brazil, it wasn't until 68 that the military finally left power, but shortly thereafter, they began to build a strong trade union movement, and eventually Lula, who hopefully in a month will be president of Brazil. But though all these governments came in, Uruguay, even Paraguay, which has been controlled by Stroessner and fascists from the beginning, had a progressive government voted in. And the US was freaking out because you had the Cuba, Chile, the Cuba, Venezuela, the Cuba, Brazil. It was all based on Soviet ties through Cuba. And it was an invasion of the Soviet Union coming in and taking over our backyard.
That's what the US government charged.
That's what
and
they
the
charged.
Politicians.
And so they helped a second round of getting rid of progressive governments. They got Morales out of Bolivia, and AIFLD was totally, and the ITS, totally involved. A friend of mine happens to be the head of the International Metal Workers Federation Latin American section. He's Brazilian, and I met him years and years ago when I took my students to Brazil once a year. He said the US was completely involved in getting that fascist queen to take over the country, who's now been defeated. They were very active against Chavez, and they're even more active against Maduro. Biden makes me sick. He talks about people leaving Cuba and Venezuela because of how bad it is. It's bad because the US economic boycott doesn't allow any boat, any country to trade with Cuba if they want to trade with the United States. It's not just that they don't trade with Cuba. They stop all the other countries from trading. And when I was in Cuba some time ago, we had an incredible presentation on what happened when the Soviet Union took its support out of Cuba. They call it the dark period. There was no gasoline, there was no electricity. Even the first time I went there, you would pray that something would come out of the spigot when you soaked up your hair. Usually nothing came out, sometimes cold water, never hot water, because of the blockade. And in telling about it, people would cry. I cried. I couldn't believe what we had done and what we keep doing.
And the AFL-CIO supports these sanctions.
Yes, totally. Well, anybody that would have worked with AFL, with an ITS during this period is anti-democratic. See, what they say, they're all fighting communism. What is communism? Communism is any organization or person who questions US imperialism, US military interventions, US corporate interventions. In other words, it's not leftists. It's anybody who opposes US hegemony, anyone. And so that takes the entire labor movement of Latin America and makes them communist. Therefore, we have to go in on the ground floor and find our supporters, usually the people who will take bribes, the corrupt ones, and work. I mean, not just split, did everything. In one campaign at the ITT company in Chile, 15 years before Allende, they actually held all these meetings, created a circle of talented people, and went out and paid the dues. The US AFL paid the dues to the Federation in Chile so they could all rejoin and create a walkout at the next convention. And then they flew people from all over the country. And Doherty even says, we have to fight communism at all costs. Don't worry about the cost. We will take care of everything. That's a quote.
So the intervention in the unions in Chile, trying to subvert them, trying to crush them. In Chile, were people in the unions aware of the role of the AFL-CIO and the CIA?
Yeah, here's an interesting story that's also personal. But, I worked with this group of people writing a book on the gremios, these associations that led the October strike, including the ones that the AFL-CIO created and ran. And when the book came out in August of '73, right before the coup, in a book on Nixon and Chile, it talks about how when that book came out, the AFL-CIO totally freaked out. They have a whole chapter on AFL, and they name everybody and the contacts. And had not a friend of mine who was still in Chile sent me a copy, I'm not sure that anybody would have access to a copy, but I gave mine to a young person who digitalized the book. So now you can't hide it anymore. But they totally freaked out. And I'm sure they pushed the coup heavily at that point because everything else had failed. The Chilean UP knew too much about the coup efforts, and they had to move. And they killed 2 members of FIN. They arrested a few more, and it was very hard to get out of Chile after the coup. They raided almost everybody's apartment for anything. God forbid you had a book by Lenin. You were mincemeat. The US made it possible, I believe.
And the AFL-CIO, these officials that lead the AFL-CIO, Liz Schuller, the leaders of the CWA, AFSCME, national unions in the AFL-CIO, have they been held accountable for what happened in Chile? I mean, you're saying thousands of people were killed, thousands of trade unions.
No one has been held accountable. And my effort through the LACHA to have the AFL open their books failed because the leaders of LACHA, the Labor and Working Class History Association, it's the left version of the OAH, the Organization of American Historians. they would not even discuss the motion. They said, let us work it out, which led to the following statement from AFL. We looked into it. We don't have the sources to go through the files right now. In other words, you can't see our files until we clean them. And we don't have the time to clean them right now.
So the historians in the United States, labor historians who are in this association, how do they justify not saying that the book should be opened in the AFL-CIO for the working people in this country, the trade unionists, to actually have a record of what happened?
It was an institutional position by the leaders to allow the AFL to take the lead, because they need the AFL to do their research. You're talking academics. You want to get into SEIU and do a paper on something, you better be in the good graces. Now, not that the president of SEIU would support the CIA. I do not believe that she would. They have not been held accountable at all. And also there were unions. The newspaper guild that would become a part of the CWA had a huge campaign to stop funding AFL, a little known campaign to stop funding AFL. And there were a few other unions, but not only was Liz Schuller on the board of NED, so is Fred Redmond, the vice president of the Steelworkers, an African-American who fought for justice all his life. What's he doing there? And it's because the level of understanding so low. They don't know their history. And therefore, how can you attack the AFL-CIO when they're down? I've been told that. Don't publish your stuff. You don't want to attack the labor movement right now when it's down. No, you want to hold up these collaborators and fascists who don't care enough about the workers of the world to come clean? So no, and attempts to hold them accountable have not worked, although California worked the hardest at it. And there were other locals, Rob, what he did in Minnesota, and Frank and what he did in the UAW. So there are people who tried. And it was very hard. I took a job teaching labor studies in 1981. And so that's probably why my files were in a file cabinet in the back of my closet. Because if I was going to work with labor leaders in Northwest Indiana, they wouldn't want to know what I thought about the AFL-CIO's international affairs. And so there's all these pressures to not do it, not turn against the AFL when they're down. But it's so clear that the strength of the labor movement is almost entirely outside of organized labor. It's in the Starbucks, in the Amazons, in all of these places where young people have taken it into their own hands to organize where they already work, not as colonizers or people who are going in to teach the working class how to think. But it's going to take a long time. And I don't trust the AFL-CIO. They're totally in love with the NED. They have the same view. They call what they preach free trade unionism. They mean free of any worker control. That's what they mean. Free has come to mean the opposite of what it is.
And doesn't it really mean, if you take all this money for the AFL-CIO, from the US government through National Endowment for Democracy, $75 million for the international operation, doesn't it mean that you're actually an appendage of the US government, of US imperialism?
It's funny. There was a huge debate during the Alliance for Progress between Meany and the people who knew what they were about, who would say, just say we're only a contractor with the Alliance for Progress. We are not, because they had to get the US government label off their heads if they were going to go into Latin America in the 60s and work for the US corporations. They had to not look so completely embedded in the US government. So they would have these arguments. We have to say that we're just a contractor. The State Department, this is where they came out vigorously against AFL and what the AFL was doing, and they hated George Meany and all the people he appointed. I didn't know these internecine battles until I did my interviews with all those liberal State Department people and then all those reactionary ITS people who were so proud of what they had done. And remember, I did the interviews in 1973, mainly 74 in the United States. And I just said I was totally sympathetic, and they believed me and let me go through their books, let me see everything. That's where I got a hold of that's where I got the questionnaires and stuff from. They just gave it to me because at that point, they didn't expect a university professor, even though I was at that point fired. No, I quit. I never got fired. I quit. One day I went into a meeting with a few of these ITS AFL people. And when I walked in the room, the head guy said, "Aha, it's Mata Hari." Mata Hari was a very famous spy in World War II. So what I said was, I better be careful now. I've been got. And I had to back down some because, one of the things that Walter Polizzi told me about, which I didn't even put most of it in my articles that I didn't publish, is he personally knew 6 people who worked for AFL and died from sudden deaths, usually heart attacks. He said there were 3 methods they used to get rid of people they didn't like. There was the umbrella stick, which I think Bulgaria used too. There was pushing you in front of a train in the metro, or breaking open a cyanide tablet near you that would cause a heart attack. And then he goes on to say, and this is pretty startling, that he thinks Serafino Romualdi, the CIA first head of AFL, died of a sudden heart attack. And he explains to me that Meany forced him to retire. He wanted this other guy. He wanted Doherty in there, not Serafino. And Serafino refused to step down. And then he tried to go after Meany. And then Meany, and then he decided he needed at least an ambassadorship. And when he didn't get it, he started going public with the corruption in AFL and the AFL, at which point he had a sudden heart attack. It might not be true.
So, I mean, these officials in the AFL-CIO actually, what you're saying, have blood on their hands. They were aware of what they were doing.
They knew exactly what they were doing. And they exactly knew that they were turning names of workers over to the military, to the right wing. That's what they did. They would go into a local, let's say, promise a housing project. Everybody who wanted to be in it would have to fill out this questionnaire so they knew what their political affiliations were. And then they would turn that information over to the military or to the right wing, gremial. Yeah, blood, pure blood.
And it's never been really made available to the membership of workers in the United States. And these activities have never been held accountable. The AFL-CIO has never been held accountable. The CWA, all these unions who are involved in it have never been held accountable. Is that what you're saying?
That's right. No, and, did everybody know? I asked this of Walter Polizzi. He said, no, there were people working for AFL who had no idea what was going on. He said once he got suspicious, he said he had 2 ways of identifying the CIA people. 1, their desk would be clean. 2, they would have laundry in their drawers. Now that might have been a joke on his part, but it's a good joke if it is.
Now, this issue of the rise of fascism and the fact that the AFL-CIO through the Solidarity Center have actually supported right-wing fascist forces around the world, how is that relevant to what is happening internationally with the rise of fascism and the rise of fascism in the United States?
Well, there are very many parallels and very many connections. I just rewatched. There's a 3-part film called The Battle for Chile, which was done by a Chilean in Chile from 72 to 73. And it was his father who snuck the footage out of the country because he was arrested and put into the stadium. These films show how the right-wing rise of the bourgeoisie, how the fascist coup took form. And it is so similar. They didn't suddenly overthrow Allende. First, there were lots of false tries. One, they ended up killing the general of the armed forces, Rene Schneider. The US was totally behind that assassination. It was totally stupid because it put Allende into office. Then they tried, the stoppage in October, then the strikes in April, and then they started more boycotts and more strikes. And they had something that we call the tancazo, the tank brigade or the tank incident. There were many attempts to overthrow the government. Sections of the military, but not enough sections. Sections of the right wing, but not strong enough yet. And what we've seen in this country with these fascist organizations, with the attack on January 6th, is all leading up to a very long-term plan for a coup. And it looks so much like the plan that was used in Chile that it gives me the creepos, because it's a similar strategy. Divide the workers, invade and pull people out of it. We don't have an armed forces like Chile, because the Chilean armed force was fed and groomed by the US military. All their money came from the US. The US military actually has some people who believe in democracy.
Part 1 of WorkWeek's interview with labor historian and professor Ruth Needleman.